Uh, Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this evening's book presentation. It's another event in our series Books in Perspective. My guest this evening is Luuk van Middelaar, whose seminal book on the history of the European Union, The Passage to Europe, has been quite recently translated into German. You can see the German edition on our table here. Luuk van Middelaar is a philosopher, political theorist, politician. He is one of the quite rare examples of people who combine academic rigor with political practical experience. He is currently professor, he holds a chair of Foundations and Practice of the European Union and its institutions at the Faculty of Law of Leiden University, and he actually divides his time between Leiden and Louvain, where he holds a Foundation Louvain chair in European Studies. But before moving back or returning to the academia, he was also active politically. At the EU level, he served as an advisor and speechwriter to the European Council President Herman van Rompuy. And before that, he was also an advisor at the office of the European Commissioner Fritz Bolkestein. So as you can see, we will have the opportunity to discuss both more practical, down-to-earth matters regarding the European Union, as well as more theoretical aspects of the European Union and its future. And on top of that, Luuk van Middelaar is also very active as a political commentator since his student times, even as I found out.
Yes, yes.
But now he's writing for major Dutch and European publications, including Handelsblad, Le Monde, Die Zeit, and also American Wall Street Journal. I'm very happy that he accepted our invitation to come to the Institute and discuss the book and its new German incarnation, because there is a new preface to the German edition, which is an essay in its own right. Thank you very much for being with us, and let me just quickly explain the format of the event to those of you who are here for the first time. Our book presentations are usually opened with a short statement from the author, around 10-15 minutes, followed up by a conversation with a discussant, me in this case. I'm Pavel Marczewski, Head of Publications at the Institute. And then after half an hour, we'll open the floor for questions, remarks, comments from the audience. So you are very welcome to join us in our conversation. Now I'll leave the floor to Luuk van Middelaar.
Thank you, Pavel, for this introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to be in a book-filled room as beautiful as this one on a nice day. I'm very much so looking forward to the discussion and to hear what your thoughts or inquiries at the moment are, knowing, of course, that it is very, in a way, a special, difficult moment for the European Union this very year, as a big European election year. Last year it was more Austria. Everybody was following what was happening in Austria. This year it is Dutch elections. I'm from the Netherlands. That is in 5-6 days. French and German elections, where especially in the French case, which is the most important one, we'll no doubt discuss about it, but Europe really is under pressure, because for the first time, the forces that not only want to improve Europe or change it or reform it, but there are strong forces that want to destroy the European Union following the Brexit vote and the Trump election. And I think that is something new, something worrying. It's not catastrophic, but it is indeed, it should spur all of us to think again and anew about what is there to defend in the European Union, what it exactly is, and why and how we could defend it. And I was struck, Paul, by the fact that you called me a politician. I do not think of myself as a politician as such, but it is true in a way that what I aim to do, and also in this book, here's the English edition, The Passage to Europe, I try to do politics with words in a way, by trying to change the way people look at things, and in particular in the way people look at the European Union. And one of the aims in the book is to bring together all the thinking and writing about Europe as the Brussels institutions, as the EU, this world of acronyms and inexplicable procedures where nobody understands what's precisely going on, that EU, to bring that together, to link it to Europe, to the continent as such, to our history, to Europe also as an idea of a civilization, and Europe as a club of countries. And well, in our discussion, we can talk more in detail how I try to achieve that. But perhaps as a kickoff, in these few remarks, I would rather look forward and drawing on let's say, my own reflections and writing and experience, indeed, both as a writer and an intellectual and as a practitioner, to just briefly mention three key words, key things the European Union has to learn in order to survive at in this kind of Sternstunde, this moment of truth. And these three words, which I would like to throw in to start, are protecting, improvising, and allowing opposition. So there are three kind of verbs. There are three difficult things to do for the European Union, because it was not built to protect, it was not built to improvise, and it was not built to allow opposition. And yet, it is necessary in the current circumstances for the European Union to develop this capacity. Now, first on protection, I think there it is to be seen most clearly, and it is very evident, and to some extent it has already also been recognized by political leaders that Europe has to change. Now, why do I say protection? And what does it change? Historically, the European Union was built as a market to produce freedom, to open up space, tear down borders, make sure that goods and people could move freely between all the countries, ever more countries which were members of the club. So Europe is the friend of all those who like freedoms and opportunities. And in the process, policymakers, political leaders have underestimated that this Europe of freedoms is not appreciated equally by all Europeans, and that there are also many citizens in all our countries who perceive these freedoms of Europe not as an advantage, as an opportunity, as something to cherish for its values and opportunity, but as a threat. A threat for your jobs, because foreigners can also move freely around and could take your job. A threat for identity, for culture. And that is a real battle that is going on there between two groups of citizens. I would definitely not say the elite and the people. It's more like two peoples, two worldviews competing. And the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom can best be described as a fight between those who like the freedoms of Europe and those who wanted more protection. The end result, the dramatic end result, as you know, was 48 against 52, and the UK is now leaving, which is a sign that this is a very existential question, because it's not only in the UK that this plays a role. It's not just English stubbornness or insularity or silly Britishness, but it is an issue which plays a role also in France, very much, where Europe is described as the Trojan horse of globalization, le cheval de Troie de la mondialisation. It's a very striking image for the French. So Europe is basically not a bulwark against the outside forces, but seen as a threat to which they enter. And the thing is that if Europe, as a response to the Brexit vote and these kind of things, if the European Union just says to itself now, we need to do better what we already do, then you would basically still work for your own clients, the 50%, the 48%, the 55% of the people who like what the EU is doing. People with diplomas, people who speak foreign languages, read books, people in this room, and to which I happily belong. But you would then still forget about the other half. And if you continue that, you would in the end could lose more majorities in other member states, and therefore the EU needs to find a new balance between freedom, which it should continue to provide, but balancing with protection. To give a concrete example, it's great to have a space of freedom without internal borders, but as the EU has discovered in the refugee crisis above all, that also requires to have external borders to at least control your outer borders. So there you have this balance which needs to be found between freedom and protection. I think it is urgent. It brings me to my second concept after protecting, that is improvisation. That is a word which is very ambiguous. I know, when do you improvise? When you're ill-prepared. And Europe has been ill-prepared in some of these crises. But improvisation in another circumstance can also be appreciated as an art, like in the jazz music, where the best improviser is the hero of the arena or in the debate. And improvising is something what European politicians have had to learn. To give 3 examples. What you do when suddenly a country is about to go bankrupt, and in the space of a weekend you have collectively to organize 500 billion of euro to help it save from bankruptcy within 48 hours. That was the start of the Greek debt crisis in May 2010. What do you do when little green men invade a neighboring country, and within a few days you have to decide how are you going to respond with sanctions to the aggressor? It was the start of the Ukraine crisis with Russia 3 years ago. And what do you do when quite suddenly, if not perhaps that suddenly, 1 million refugees walk over the Balkans towards the northwest of Europe, leaving holes in Dublin and Schengen and all nice legal arrangements that Europeans had? There also decisions had to be taken. There was pure improvisation. Because in all these 3 examples, leaders, national leaders, European institutions had to take decisions under high time pressure. They could not, what in Brussels they like to do, spend years to negotiate a new rule, start with the green book, with stakeholder consultation, for those of you who know this world, and then after the green book you do a white book, and then you negotiate between the parliament and the council in various rounds, and then 7 years later 7 years later, you may have a new rule. That's how Europe was built. And that was a great success for what Europe first did to build a market. It's great to determine the price of butter and wheat and to harmonize VAT rules, but it doesn't work to do this new kind of politics, what I call the politics of events, where you have to deal with sudden disruptions of the order at the borders or banks and currency, etc. So this art of improvisation, of dealing with these unforeseen circumstances, Ereignisse, is crucial. And if you allow me one institutional remark, I don't want to do too much of that here, but this shift from Europe, the old Europe of the market, which was a rule-making machine, to Europe which has to deal with events, not because it likes to do so, but because it's forced to do so under the pressure of events in the changing world. This shift, this metamorphosis, is, in my view, the main reason of the shift in power from the Commission to the European Council. That has nothing to do with that Commission presidents are weak, as people always say, since because they all love Jacques Delors so much and don't like his successes. That's just a detail. The fact that the European Council, where presidents and prime ministers and chancellors sit together like they do today, 5, 6 times a year, to together set the course for the Union, is because only they, as national leaders, have the force of public conviction, the force of, let's say, of legitimacy, to take these kind of decisions under the time pressure where you have to decide about billions of euros, about sovereignty and identity, about war and peace. The Commission and the Parliament, unfortunately, perhaps we can talk about it, but cannot do that. And therefore, under all these events, we see, it's probably a theme we can develop as well, but that the Brussels politics and national politics gets ever more intertwined. Because under the pressure of these events, the borders, the currency, foreign affairs, as national leaders are grappling with these events jointly, they discover, and not all of them like it all the time, I have witnessed that up front, they discover that they are in Europe. If you're a Dutch prime minister, I'm from a relatively mildly Eurosceptic country, they don't like that, but they have to accept that. And this element of improvisation, so is the second thing of the second new element. But the third concept I want to throw in is linked to this metamorphosis. It is, as you remember, allowing political opposition to speak out. It's also new. It's also very difficult, but it is necessary. The old Europe of the market was, nobody cared that much about who was doing what, and it didn't really matter. It could take place as an anonymous bureaucracy, again, to decide about safety rules for toys, for instance, or that kind of thing. And me as a consumer, or even as a citizen, I don't really care who makes these rules about safe toys, unless I can be sure that when I buy a toy for my son or a cousin, that it's safe, right? But it's different. It's different when we're talking about, as in all these examples I mentioned, about hundreds of billions of euros, about refugees, about matters of war and peace. Then the public, the people, the voters, the taxpayers, they want to have a say. Not necessarily to say no, some want to say yes, but they want to participate and they want to have a say. And that's quite simply the change from, let's say, a bureaucratic system to a real and more political one, which is taking place under the pressure of events. But the EU is not at all been organized to allow for that, because it is, or perhaps some of you have experienced it yourself in one way or the other, but Brussels is a consensus-producing machine. Everybody at the end of the day has to agree, and then we say that there are no winners and losers because we don't do politics. It's only about finding solutions for technical problems. And it's made designed in such a complicated way procedurally that you have to be a well-paid lobbyist to find out who is exactly responsible for what. If you're a poor citizen, then you are confronted with decisions, rules that come out of this black box, and you don't know where to shout against whom or when to applaud, if you like it, because it's just not clear. And I will just sketch the fundamental problem here and not venture into solutions, but the fundamental problem is that for any political system, and political scientists have very practical words for this, they say, well, basically, there's two kinds of opposition. Classical opposition between a government and an opposition, like, for instance, you have in the UK, or between left and right, where the opposition does not like the government, as an opposition shouldn't like the government, but still accepts the legitimacy of the government. The other system is opposition of principle. Opposition, fundamentale Opposition, probably you would say in German, where the opposition does not accept the legitimacy of the existing political order and wants a revolution or a coup or whatever. Now, what political scientists have said since the 1960s is that if a political system does not allow space for classical opposition, and the EU doesn't, that feeds in a quite natural manner, it increases the chances that at the end of the day you will be confronted with opposition of principle, fundamental opposition. And that is what we are seeing now. Brexit was also a way of fundamental opposition just by leaving. But what we also see in France, for instance, where the fact that the French have the impression that they have overthrown their kings, put them under the guillotine, which is a great historic success in the French citizens' mind, but whatever Jean-Claude Juncker says, they have no influence on it. They find that a bit bizarre, and in the UK as well. And I know here in Austria and in the Netherlands it's the same. We come from a country of coalition governments, and we are a bit less worried by this, and we know that consensus is important, but there are also political cultures in Europe which have a different view of that. Now, this of course, perhaps one institutional remark. It's not a scoop what I'm saying, and the need to organize a system of classical opposition. And people in Brussels have thought about it for a long time, and the last European elections, when the parties experimented with the idea of Spitzenkandidaten, was in a way an attempt to bring in more politics. To say, okay, we elect a parliamentary majority which supports the Commission, which, though, presupposes that the Commission would be a government. And that would be, let's say, the way we know it to introduce classical opposition in the system. However, this very attempt, at the same time, increases opposition of principle, because there are many people, perhaps even more, who would think that they never want to have a European government being a commission, and they become even more hostile against the whole enterprise. So there is a kind of impasse there, and yet a solution will have to be found. So, and perhaps we can also talk about it. But so these are the challenges, herausforderungen I wanted to throw in to kick off Europe, which in the current juncture, in order to survive, has to learn to not only provide freedoms as we like them, but also to offer protection, which clearly needs to do this most difficult thing, is to learn the art of political improvisation. And finally, which has to allow a space for opposition. And, well, that's perhaps much more easily said than done. And what I, like others in the room, try to do as a writer or an intellectual is well, to tackle this indirectly by helping to change Europe's self-image, to the way it looks at itself and the way we understand Europe, to avoid some of the pitfalls, some of the wrong solutions, and to get to know Europe better. So far, for my einleitende Beschießungen.
Thank you, and let me follow up with a few questions. Having listened to these three key challenges that you mentioned in your opening statement: protection, improvisation, space or possibilities for opposition, and after having read your book, I asked myself, to what extent are these challenges really new? It seems to me that Europe has managed quite well without actually solving these dilemmas decisively. You mentioned in the book that from the very beginning, a major existential challenge for the EU was the challenge of majority. An attempt to impose a certain system or even impose a certain set of values on the member states. And you provide a lot of examples of resistance to this. Starting with Václav, providing an example of Václav Klaus, who in 1994 said, well, we have to be careful because the Czech Republic might dissolve in the European Union like a sugar cube. But there are earlier similar concerns. You also provide an example of a British leader of the opposition who in the 60s said that with the European Union and with the EU accession of the UK, 1,000 years long history of the kingdom might as well end. So to what extent are these challenges really new? Europe has managed with them without actually solving them for years. So why are they so pressing now? What has changed?
Well, I think indeed in the book I describe some of the early starts of the instruments and first responses to some of these challenges. But I just think that they are currently much more pressing, because there is a popular revolt going on, which, as I said at the beginning, does not simply wants to destroy the European Union, and which has support from Moscow, perhaps a bit for some people in London, not from the government, which is strengthened even from Washington now. That is also a major shift. I mean, the whole European integration for 70 years has taken place with the consent and under the encouragement of all successive American administrations since Harry Truman. And we will see what the next months with the Trump administration, I was going to say Trump regime, but maybe we can wait still with that, with what the Trump administration will bring. But in any case, that is a historic shift, which on the side of, let's say, protection, poses a really unprecedented challenge. In the same way, the change to a Europe which is able to deal with events, yes, there have been early starts. I speak, for instance, about the birth of the European Council in 1974, where the body of prime ministers and presidents, which was not at all foreseen in the initial setup, because government leaders were always historically distrusted by the original founding fathers of Spaak and Monet, because the founding fathers thought that if you bring in national leaders, you would be back at the world before 1939, before 1914, of power play and old-style democracy, which would undermine the very idea that the European Union would be a new start. So there have been forerunners for that, but it's just all much more intense now. I am an historian like you, and I'm not So I do hope not to fall into the trap of the journalist who every day thinks that this is the most historic day we have ever lived. I do think that there is, and that people feel that there is a kind of historic acceleration which we are now living, perhaps just as in the years after 1989, where the last time around, in a way, we felt in Europe that there was a kind of history on the move, and therefore some of these things are new. But it's indeed always interesting also to see continuities. The leader of the British opposition you mentioned was in 1962. Was a man called Arthur Beazley. He was the Labour leader, and he did this big speech on a party conference, which they always hold in October or so at the coast. And he did this big speech where he said, "If we join the club, it will indeed, as you quoted, it will be the end of 1,000 years of history." And then, whoa, the whole room roared. And he said to his wife, "Yeah, look," I forgot her first name, but let's call her Anne. "Look, Anne, they're all clapping." And then she said to him, "But Arthur, it's all the wrong people who are clapping." and you can still feel that today. I mean, who is cheering now in the UK?
Coming to your second point, namely improvisation, one of the leitmotifs of the book is this dichotomy which you already mentioned between events and rules or laws, and you also, I mean, I'm wondering to what extent are you kind of smuggling in this form into the book this relatively old conception about the necessity of balance between Germany and France, because you associate the events as a source of new chances, new openings, new vital energy for countries and states and nations and societies with France, and you associate rules with Germany and with German experiences after the war, and with German attempt to come to terms with its own history. So I'm wondering to what extent are you sort of smuggling national character through the back door in your analysis, and if that is the case, to what extent can we overcome the crisis of kind of re-emergence of national identities and national politics in Europe if your analysis itself rests on national character?
Well, there are many steps in the argument in one question, but it is an interesting, a very pertinent question. Let's start with the first step. I think there is two types. I mean, the dichotomy is to say there's two types of politics. There's politics where you try to achieve a system of predictability as a political system in which citizens and economic actors can deploy their talents, their energy, etc. And you do that by embedding all these action in a system of rules, and that is very useful and necessary. And that is, by the way, what most of our governments and parliaments and administrations do. It's a daily job, this rule-making thing. The fact is, however, that there can be times where you cannot work within an existing order, but where this order is challenged. For instance, when there is a sudden economic crisis, the banking crisis, when all the predictions which the planning and the statisticians have made just go wild and are useless. The same is when there is a war, of course, is the worst situation. And in these situations, you cannot draw back on existing rules, and you need a different political quality. It's also needed. So let's say in a rule system, you need Angela Merkel, indeed, to take a German example, but François Hollande was also a kind of rule politician. You need a quality of predictability, of trust, and perhaps even be a little boring. At least in my country, it's seen as an asset for a politician in the rule-making system. Whereas in the event politics, as a politician, maybe you don't need it that often if you're lucky, but you need other talents, you need bluff, you need chutzpah, you need courage, you need tricks. And I don't identify them one-on-one with Germany and France, not at all. I'm just saying that when you look at the history of EU integration, it is true that, let's say, the talents and the qualities associated with rules come more from Germany, whereas those who have broad initiative, Sarkozy style, is more from France. And that is important indeed. That's why your question is interesting, because if we now need more political leadership which is able to take initiatives to act under pressure without going through all these consultations with the whole world, and France is no longer there, because that was more or less implicit, I think, in your question, the fact that the balance between Germany and France is well, there's no balance anymore. Right? Germany dominates, and France is playing a second fiddle. The UK is out. That is problematic, indeed. And the Germans will not alone be able to compensate for that. And therefore, it is in the German interest also to make sure that France remains strong and produces a kind of leadership which even could challenge them. It would be paradoxically in the German interest to organize its own counterweights. But I don't link it to national characteristics as such. I think that's a bit too stretched.
So let me follow up and ask you about the more specific dimension of what you called the necessity to provide space and to secure space for the opposition. One of the new challenges or new developments in the EU that you mentioned in the new preface to the German edition is what you call Europeanization of national politics instead of renationalization of European politics. So what you're, as far as I understood, what you're arguing is that it's not so much that countries of the European Union are suddenly returning to national politics. It has always been like that. But the novelty would be that internal affairs or national politics is suddenly being transferred to the European level. We have just witnessed a quarrel or a fight between the Polish government and the rest of the European Union. By the way, Donald Tusk has just been elected for the second term as the president of the Council of Europe, European Council. And 27 countries voted for him. The only exception, the only no vote came from his own and my own country from Poland. So is this an example of the process you're describing, Europeanization of national politics? And if we need to secure space for the opposition, for dissenting voices, how do we do it in such a way that this phenomenon of Europeanization of national politics won't become disruptive for the whole Union?
Yeah, that's a big question. Perhaps first on what is so important, this idea of Europeanization of national politics is a bit I use this term to counter a typical Brussels critique, which was very clearly heard during the Euro crisis. Also, people like Jacques Delors, Jürgen Habermas, by the way, so also great intellectuals, said, well, when Merkel and Sarkozy were dealing with saving the euro, they thought it was bad and they saw that it was renationalization of European politics because national leaders were dealing with the currency instead of EU leaders. I thought that was a wrong analysis, or at least it can be challenged, because you could turn it around and say, well, it is normal that they deal with it because it's their currency for their taxpayers, but why don't you interpret it more positively as to say, well, it is, as you mentioned, a Europeanization of national politics. It is an awareness that grows, that has been growing dramatically in the Euro crisis, I think, and also later, of the fact that what it means to share a currency with other countries. The fact that, well, basically from 2010 on, we as, let's say, citizens of Euro countries have experienced that you have to follow what's going on next door. You have to know what's happening in Greece and Italy and Portugal and Finland if you want to know what will happen to your own pensions and your own savings and perhaps your own job in certain cases. So a discovery of economic interdependence, but also perhaps even more interestingly and strikingly, a discovery of political interdependence. The fact that we are now following each other's elections so closely. The whole of Europe has called you last year to know what was going on in Austria, and now they're calling, all Brussels correspondents call me about the Netherlands. People want to know who will win the German elections, people in Greece and Spain and Portugal, because they know it will be important for them. It's completely new. And so if you have a purely Brussels perspective and say, well, European elections, ladies and gentlemen, that's only once every 5 years, 2014 and 2019 again. Well, that is a too easy and too small way of looking at it. Europe is not just Brussels. Europe is a club of member states, and we have European elections all the time because they matter for European public space. It's a cacophonous public space, and sometimes we're shouting at each other, but I think we have to learn to see the European Union indeed as a club of democracies, where the European Parliament has its role, but also all the other parliaments and elections. And in that context, I use this word Europeanization of national spheres, which has come about, I think first, as I said, during the Euro crisis, but with the refugee crisis in a way, there was the same phenomenon. And there will be others in the years ahead. And is it good or is it bad? Well, at least it's fascinating, it's interesting. I personally think it's good, because it is, in my view, the way for Europe to become stronger if people realize that Europe is also them, it's not just out there in Brussels. What was the second element of your question?
Well, the second element was whether creating spaces for opposition,
yes,
that you mentioned in your opening statement. How do we do it without getting all the negative effects of this Europeanization of national politics?
It is very difficult, and it will be disruptive. But I think it is, in a way, a price worth paying. The noise of democratic life should not only be seen as a nuisance, as many political scientists do, but the political noise and drama is also oxygen to political life. It's very difficult to organize this kind of opposition. I'm still also thinking about it, how to make it work. But I can perhaps mention one example which you will also remember. Really a spectacular experiment in political opposition was the Syriza government of Greece. What they did when they took power from January 2015 onward was something with no government before in the European Union has ever attempted in that radical and well, quite cool manner. I mean, I didn't agree with them on the substance, but as a political analyst, I thought it was pretty good what they were doing to try and change the discourse on austerity with Tsipras and Varoufakis. Also take that discourse on, in the German discourse, including in Berlin. And because they knew they would lose if they would play the usual Brussels game of compromise and consensus, that they would be completely steamrolled because they were a small country and they were poor and they were treated as badly as a bankrupt client by its bankers. So they did politics. They did real politics. They played the Putin card. As I said, they tried to change the discourse. Then Tsipras called for a referendum. It was, of course, one of the most spectacular moments in the past years. The whole world was watching it in Europe. 90 summits where you could follow over Twitter who was saying what against whom. It was also very visible drama. It's not the old style bureaucratic policy making. This was grabbing headlines all over Europe. Now, in the end, they lost in a way, or they didn't, or they split course between Varoufakis and Tsipras. Varoufakis was the real revolutionary. He wanted to go even further, and Tsipras, in the end, decided that, as let's say the spokesman of poor Greek people, he would serve their interest better by staying inside the euro than by leaving the euro, I think. But still, what they achieved there was remarkable, also in restoring the dignity of the Greek people in the process. But it was disruptive, it was noisy, it was dangerous, and there were not many people in Brussels who liked it. But it is something to really look at, and not as something only interesting for let's say, for anecdotes or for journalists, but as a real serious political phenomenon, as an experiment in political opposition.
Well, when you said that it's relatively new that people in different European countries are following events and following elections in other countries that belong to the EU, I'm just wondering whether we have paradoxically Eurosceptics to thank for this, because people are suddenly concerned about Gerd Wilders, people are concerned about Orban, people are concerned about Kaczynski, and it brings a paradoxical effect of kind of raising the European awareness, because Poles might have elected the conservative far-right government, but at the same time they are very Euro-enthusiastic. Even the youngest voters who usually, who predominantly vote far-right in Poland, over 70% of them are happy to be in the European Union, right? So paradoxically, the real challenge or the real threat to the European Union has awoken this awareness. And when you mentioned experiments with doing politics in an entirely different manner, as Syriza did in the very beginning, this brings me to my last question before I give the audience a chance to comment and ask questions. In the final part of your book, you are discussing 3 different types of public spheres or public opinions or public or audiences in the European Union, focused on either cultural and historical identity, clientelism, or bringing basically everything out in the open and voting. So these 3 strategies of building a political audience within the EU. So I'm wondering, to what extent are these 3 different strategies? Are they an asset? Are they in conflict with each other? Are they simply giving the European politicians a repertoire to deal with the current crisis or current challenges? Should we do away with these differences and focus on only one strategy, because this would be more efficient to bring Europe together?
Yeah, my idea actually, when perhaps it's good to tell that I first started to work on this book after another period as a political advisor on the Dutch political scene. I worked in the parliament, also during the Dutch referendum we had in 2005 on the constitutional treaty, just like France. There was this double no vote against the treaty then, and I campaigned there for the yes vote, and it was the first time I really experienced the deep distrust, not just against the government, but against Europe as such. And there I realized, and I somehow knew at the back of my mind I wanted to write about Europe, but that this question of public opinion, the public, is unumgänglich, and there's no way around it, and it had to be dealt with. And what I did in the passage to Europe is to look at everything what already had been tried. It's sometimes useful, because you can, of course, start thinking from scratch, but a lot of things have already been tried. And the strategies I describe, I call them the German strategy of identity politics, the Roman strategy of bread and circuses and offering advantages to clients, and the Greek or Athenian strategy of giving people a say on democracy. They can be pursued in parallel. Yes, they do not contradict each other. It's all ways and means which Europe, as a national state, does the same thing. You offer results to your people. Let's take China. China does 2 out of 3. They don't do democracy, but they do results, and they do a little bit of identity and nationalism. So it's just a way to look at any political order. But for Europe, all of them have proven difficult. Identity politics easily runs into resistance of nationalism. Because if we say, okay, because we are all Europeans, we need a European flag and we need a European anthem, then some people, as happened also in the Netherlands and the UK and elsewhere, say, well, the European flag, oh my God, it's the end of our national flag, it's the end of our national state, here is the European superstate. So identity politics is tricky. The politics of results is good, but only gets you as far as it gets you. It's a fair weather strategy. And that was what happened in the crisis, the banking, the economic, financial crisis, that nothing worked anymore, and that Europe, which had also with the Barroso Commission had decided, well, we only need to be pragmatic, we just need to deliver what people want and to give results. Then Europe realized, well, if the economy is collapsing, if unemployment is rising, if our currency is going down the drain, then we have no story whatsoever anymore. And the idea to give people a say in elections, that brings us also back to the themes of opposition, also has had, well, successes and drawbacks. I describe it very much as let's say, as a top-down operation, from the point of view of politicians. I now think it's also important to look at how people have looked at European politics and have tried to make a point. Perhaps I can give one example of this identity politics and why it's also useful sometimes to do a bit of history. Every 3 years, people come up with the idea, okay, let's make a book of history for young kids of 14 years old, where all across Europe they will learn the same stories about Europe. Well, this has been tried, and it never worked. And there's one so far, at least. In the 1990s, when there were still only 12 member states, they brought 12 historians together to write each chapter of a book of European history. It's a great idea. But then they were discussing their draft chapters in the committee meeting, as you do, and then immediately they started to have disputes about words. Well, for instance, between the French and the German historian, they had a fight because in the chapter on France, it was about 4th century Gaul. It spoke about the barbaric invasions, and the German didn't like it, preferred that one would speak about the Germanic invasions. Huh? And something like that happened also in the chapter about Spain, or there was a spat between Spain and the United Kingdom about what to call Sir Francis Drake. I know him as Sir Francis Drake, and as a British hero, but for the Spaniards he was just a pirate, right? So it's very difficult to agree in Europe as about, let's say, a neutral description of our political history, because, well, we have fought all these wars with each other, and it's very difficult to unite around common heroes. Huh? I also tell the story in the book about how the banknotes were designed. It's one of my favorite stories in it. I won't have time to tell it, but in any case, look at the banknotes, euro banknotes. Huh? It's horribly boring. Huh? But they tried, and they thought, well, maybe we can do like we do in all our countries. We put great historical persons on it, or composers, or heroes. Well, they just didn't dare, because okay, they had the option. Okay, let's go for writers. There would be five coupure. What do you call it? Between 5 and the 500 euro. So you could take Shakespeare and Cervantes and Victor Hugo and Goethe. You could so that would be already 4 writers with only 3 banknotes left, and still 11 countries to go. So what do you do? And then in the end, they opted for buildings. That's what you now have in your wallet. And the initial idea was to have real buildings. The 5 euro banknote would get the Roman style, and all the way up to the 20th century Gerrit Rietveld house for the 500 euro. But even the Pont du Gard in Nîmes, the nice bridge in France, the Roman bridge, did not make it onto your 5 euro banknote, because the man who won, an Austrian, Robert Kalina, he anonymized even these buildings, and he invented for us these, let's say, completely hygienized architectural styles, where you can see, okay, well, this is supposed to represent something like antique style, but it is not even a real building. So Europe did not find feet on the ground. The positive note is they didn't go all the way for non-figurative design. Huh? So one thing was kept, which I found also moving, the idea of time, that we have a shared history, even if it's a bit hygienized, but with all these different styles and periods and metamorphoses. So there was something of history, but it was quite poor. So in these practical stories, that's how I also try to link, let's say, as I said at the beginning, Europe and this long Europe. You can feel how difficult all of this is, and still we should continue trying, I think.
Thank you. Let's open the floor for questions. We see there is someone there.
When you described improvisation, you mentioned 3 events that demanded particularly quick and creative response on the part of European Union, namely the Greek crisis, the Crimea annexation, and Brexit. I wonder which of these cases the improvisation proved particularly beautiful.
You mean where improvisation showed itself as a quality? Yes, I would. Well, I mean it's difficult, but I would take the first example of the Greek crisis, where obviously many things went wrong as well, but in the weekend I was referring to, the weekend of 7 to 10 May 2010, there was a successful improvisation in the sense that rescue money had to be found, 500 million euros, a lot of money. Sorry, 500 billion. Yeah, I'm not a number man. I'm a word man. But 500 billion, a lot of money had to be. Only 60 billion could be found on the EU budget as such, for which the Commission could guarantee. So it had to be also come from national coffers. And nobody knew quite how to do this. Still on Sunday night, the 9th of May, and the Japanese markets would open at 3 in the morning, and people knew there were like a few hours still left. And then actually this time it was a civil servant, invented, well, we can do a private law special purpose vehicle under Luxembourg law. Well, I wouldn't be able to explain more than I just said, to which all member states of the euro will give their share according to certain criteria, like in the money for the ECB. And then we have this 4,400 million, billion plus the 60, which would make 500. And that was the the predecessor to what is today the European Stability Mechanism, the kind of European IMF. But it was really under the pressure and in all the conflicts, because the Germans in particular did not want that the European Commission would decide about the money, because in Berlin they didn't trust the Commission. But the others did not want bilateral loans. So they did want something collective, and then they invented something very typical outside the treaty. So this was pure improvisation, but it worked in this case. Sometimes when it is really needed, things that were impossible before become possible. But it very much then also depends on the creativity of individual persons. So you can always worry whether it will end well, huh? But we can also all follow it. It's visible. So I would take this first one.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. There are about 101 points to raise and discuss here, but I won't go through all of them. Maybe 2 or 3, and I try to do that at a case, at a real-life case of European politics or policies or the lack of policies. My background is economics. That's why I take economics. Among economists around the world, it's pretty clear by now that the common European currency, the way it was established, was a major blunder. Ask Paul Krugman, ask Joe Stiglitz, ask anyone who doesn't have a motive to remain silent, a political motive. He would tell you the same. It's simple textbook economics, that you need to have a few preconditions in place when you go for a common currency. Robert Mundell received his Nobel Prize back in the 1960s for his work on optimum currency areas. And the preconditions simply were not there and still are not there. They're very simple to state. A common currency can work sustainably only if countries that share this currency are sufficiently homogeneous so that they respond to exogenous shocks in similar ways. This is condition number 1. That this is not the case for the Eurozone doesn't need to be commented on. If that condition is not fulfilled, then you need a very flexible labor market. Joe Stiglitz has made these points recently several times. That also is not the case in Europe for very simple historic linguistic reasons. If you have a collection of countries like European ones with language barriers of a sort that you hardly find in the Western world elsewhere, of course you can't hope for a sustainable common currency. People knew that when the euro was established. They weren't stupid, of course, they have read Mandela. For simple political reasons, it was pressed through, and it was done. It was reckless. It bordered on the well, I don't want to use derogatory terms. It was amateurish. It was reckless, and we see what the situation in Europe is. And the second point, to your dichotomy between rules, policies, I would call it. You don't have to have rules. You can do with a good policy, with a good set of policies on the one hand, and events. The two are not in opposition. You need both.
Yes, of course.
You need, if you want to deal with events successfully and rationally, you need a policy. And what Europe did, knowing that it was going for a common currency area, it did virtually nothing to reduce the language barriers within this labor market. I mean, take the extreme example. Do you think Israel would have existed to the present without the best designed language policy imposing a revitalized historic language to make for the homogeneity that is needed? Europe had to do that, and it's incredible how Hamlet's dictum was neglected. Readiness is all for Europe too. And let me try. And having done that, having gone for something that is unprecedented. Sorry, I'm making Trumpian mistakes.
Yes.
Unprecedented in the Western history, at least in economic history, without preparation, without the trace of preparation, in neglect of textbook economics. I don't know what to say about this. And what makes things worse, when it had happened, then you try to sell this ill-conceived idea with, to use a term of the day, with populist strategies. What do you tell people? Look here, the common currency is great because when you go on holiday, you don't have to change money. I mean, that is worse than Trumpian tweets. You sell people a folly by using this by abusing your citizens, and it seems that they begin to realize a certain amount of trust that is very well justified. And that's why, well, to come to the present, that's why Europe seems to be back, and not seems to be, is back to the drawing board. That's what Juncker's proposal means. Hey guys, look here, I have 5 different scenarios. Sit down, first of all, acknowledge the crucial mistakes that you made, the policy blunders, there are more than the euro. The migration case is another one. There was not a trace, also in the German case, of a policy to deal with the foreseeable development in the European Union, given the Schengen conditions.
No, okay.
And
Let's give
could-
the
yeah, we could
possibility
go
to
now,
respond.
otherwise, if
Because
we
there are
go
already a
on
lot of
with
things
one,
on the table.
But I would ask you to be a little more critical of what was going on in the EU and of the situation we're facing now. It's really a crucial point in European history. And I'm not a Eurosceptic, not at all. I'm an economic professional, and I can't deal with policy blunders and populism that tries to sell this to the population at large. Thank you.
Thanks for the points you're raising. There maybe not 101, but maybe 37 points I would like to react to, but we will have a dialogue des sourds, as the French say, between you as an economist and me as somebody who looks at politics. So I completely, I'm aware of all these debates. I wasn't in them, but I know about the weekly Krugman column against the euro between 2010 and 2012 and all that. I would just take issue with a few points. In particular, when you said that the euro had been pushed through, I quote you, for simple political reasons. Well, I think that is underestimating the historic and political forces that led to the birth of the euro in the first place. The euro, as you no doubt know, was a child in a way of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The wall came down the 9th of November 1989. The plans for the euro, of course, were already there in the drawer. At that time, they were drawn up in 88, 89. But Helmut Kohl, German Chancellor, did not want to commit to a date to even start talking about them. When the wall came down, and 3 weeks later he called for German reunification in his famous 10-Punkte-Plan, there was a lot of unrest in other capitals, and François Mitterrand, who he wanted a European currency, seized the moment, and although it was an implicit deal and it was never spelled out, at the European Summit, the 9th of December 1989, exactly 1 month later in Strasbourg, European leaders took two decisions. A, they welcomed German reunification within certain parameters, including the respect of borders. And two, they set a date to start talking about the currency for a year later. And even Kohl himself, in his memoirs, acknowledges that although he wanted to separate these two issues, he did not succeed. This means that, again, that the birth of the euro was linked to the most momentous political event that has taken place in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So it's not just a simple political opportunistic reason. It had to do with embedding Germany. A growing Germany would go from 60 to 80 million people, would upset the whole geopolitical equilibrium as it had arisen after the war, to embed Germany and its monetary power in a new Europe. And Chancellor Kohl found it important that although his own public opinion, his own central bank, his bankers hated it, and of course they had read Mundell, he pushed it through in the name of a vision for the future of Germany and the European continent, which is a different matter, I would think. Was it done without preparation? Yes and no. There were predecessors, there were experiments with the European monetary system since the 1970s. Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt started something. They also had read their Mundell. They negotiated for 2 years, and then they designed a system, the currency as it came out of the Maastricht Treaty, which, to use my terms, was only a rule-based system. The currency would have to be kept afloat, trusting Stability and Growth Pact and all these things that were made later, and it was unable to deal with any disruption. And that is what was experienced in the crisis, incapacity to deal with a shock. And they knew, indeed, and Helmut Kohl knew and others knew that when they created the euro, it was not perfect, or it was not, perhaps not even good, but it was the only euro they could get. It was not a choice between a good euro or a bad one, but between a euro and no euro at all. And that decision was taken again for historic reasons. The changes that have been made in these crisis years are quite fundamental. Now, what will happen next? I don't know. History is open. History is open. Until now, many people have lost a lot of money by betting against the euro. Many Anglo-Saxon commentators, including Nobel Prize winners you are quoting, have predicted an end date of the euro. It was not only a question if, but when the euro would collapse. Somehow, if you go and buy a newspaper tomorrow morning, you will still pay with euros. Now, Mr. Krugman can never explain that because he only is in his economic paradigm, and he forgets that there are also other reasons and motives and passions, and they may be good or wrong, but they also make human life, they make history, and they also create the unpredictability, which you may regret, but which is also what we live with. In the crisis, in any case, there were moments perhaps when it could have gone wrong, but the political will was mustered to save the euro so far. As I said, I don't know what will happen next, but a purely economic perspective cannot explain why the euro was ever decided, because it was not for economic reasons, why it was saved, nor what will happen in the future. It's just one aspect of the question.
Many thanks for your talk. Now, I should like to raise three questions. First of all, I was intrigued by your argument that Europe in this moment of crisis, in a sense, discovers for the first time something like a European public, with people being interested in national elections and government upheavals in countries which they deem to be rather distant until now. Now I'm wondering what prospects you see for the future to stabilize this emerging European discourse. Yeah? Is it a possibility? Do you see possibilities to extend this European discourse? And it has often been decried that this was one of the great problems of European unification, that we did not have a European common public. Yeah, do you see any possibility to transfer this to some more to some stronger to build it on some more stronger fundamentals? The second question I should like to raise is this question of Germany being a half hegemonic power, as some political scientists call it now. One British colleague has called it a country too big not to be a problem and too small really to solve problems. Yeah. So what for the future? I mean, you've talked about the decision to introduce the euro as one of the mechanisms really designed to embed a stronger Germany within Europe. And obviously this will be a problem, a challenge, yeah, that will remain with us in the immediate future. I mean, what mechanisms do you envisage to embed Germany within the European Union? And the third point I should like to raise is we have talked a lot about the euro and improvisation, but relatively little about the common European response to Russia and the annexation of Crimea. And obviously here there are great differences in Europe. I mean, probably the strongest antagonist of Russia, the United Kingdom, is probably going to leave the European Kingdom. The difference between, say, the political class in London and in Vienna couldn't be greater, yeah, concerning the question of Russia and the response to Russian aggression.
Thank you for these interesting questions as well. how to stabilize the European public sphere. Well, does it need to be stabilized? Huh? Or should it thrive and be perhaps fragile and come up and on and off? A public space is not only made of a common language, but it is made of stories. It is made of shared experiences or events, or a bit of common history also helps. That is what makes a common public space, and the fact that it has taken shape somehow is precisely because so much has happened these past years, to the extent, as we mentioned, that we have to really care about what's happening in elections next door. I think we can quite safely predict that we will continue to need to know each other and what is happening next door because of, let's say, all the events that we still do not know about. Well, there are some known unknowns and there are also some unknown unknowns, according to the well-known expression, which will force us as countries to work together and to be interested in ourselves. I don't know whether this also requires, but I'll think about it, but let's say a different kind of infrastructure, if that's what you're... well, definitely not in terms of language, that will not happen. In terms of media, television, maybe, yes. In terms of Euronews has been bought by NBC. An American, big American television chain has bought Euronews because they think it's important. So there are things changing also in that sphere. The fact that the British will be leaving might also have unpredictable consequences, but of course, one of the Financial Times is a kind of European newspaper, which policymakers all across Europe read, but we will lose the language which we share, well, except for Ireland, with the Brits leaving. So there are many aspects there, but in some, stabilizing is maybe not what we need. The public sphere should be cherished and will thrive on stories, and including political leaders, perhaps just add political leaders telling these stories and assuming their decisions. Now, on the role of Germany, how to embed Germany, the relative power of Germany is also a sign of the weakness of some other players, including France. I already mentioned it, I think. And I think in Europe, which I completely agree with the description of a semi-hegemon or at the same time too big and too small a country, it will require a system of balances, which we historically had with the triangle Paris, Berlin, London, and that triangle is now no longer there. I do not know what will replace it, but I think a new balance will be found there. I do not see any institutional solutions there. And the Germans themselves, sometimes, that's my worry. It is true that Germany is still, the German political elite is still very European and thinks for Europe a bit like France also in the past thought for Europe, whereas many smaller countries, including mine, perhaps yours as well, just think about themselves and they don't think for the whole. Yeah? They don't think. Germany still does that, but it often underestimates that the solutions it put forward as European solutions are perceived by many partner countries as being utterly in the German interest as well. And this was very clear in the Greek crisis, when Germany, for the good of Greece and others, imposes austerity politics, and where the others say, well, it also happens to be very good and in line with the German interest. The same happened also in the refugee crisis, actually, where, for instance, in France, they said, well, it's all very well that Frau Merkel has her Willkommenskultur, but Germany has a very weak demography, and they, of course, they can use a lot of well-educated Syrian dentists. I'm saying it a bit cynical now, but it means that, of course, in France also people were applauding, or many people, because of the, let's say, moral courage of the chancellor, but they also perceived a kind of self-interest, which the Germans are not always aware of themselves, and that makes for a difficult conversation sometimes. So it will also require Germany to be a little bit more aware of the place it has and not behave sometimes like an autistic giant. On Russia and the Crimea annexation, yes, I was still there at the time when this happened, working for President Van Rompuy. And when he called the summit 3 years ago, almost to the day, on how to deal with this. And the situation has not really changed. I mean, the positions were clear from almost from day one between the, let's say, the very assertive players, the UK, but also Sweden, Poland, the Baltic states, and more lukewarm in this region and this country as well, and countries in the middle. And yet, the fact is that almost from the start, there has been a series of unanimous decisions to have this regime of sanctions, to which each time, every 6 months, all countries sign up. Bulgaria and the UK, or Bulgaria and Estonia, or Cyprus even, very pro-Russian as well, and Poland. Not because they all agree, but because they also know that they need to keep a closed front, and that is, let's say, the strategic importance of having a closed front vis-à-vis Russia is also what holds everybody together, and President Tusk, who has just, as we heard, been renominated, to him as well, it is of a specific concern to keep all countries in line, and I think they will continue to do so.
We are already running out of time. We have time for one more question. Please go ahead. We can continue the discussion over wine and cheese downstairs. So.
Okay, my name is Gregor Woschnack. I was for 8 years Austria's permanent representative in Brussels. Now, I thought your speech was quite critical. I liked very much your book, but now in your speech you addressed the need for improvisation, something very un-Dutch, I must say, which I liked. Now, my question to you would be, can we not use improvisation, which was used in the old time, again in the crisis which we have now? For example, if you look at the coal and steel community, and then they wanted to move ahead, make a European army, and more or less with French command language, and it was a big failure because the French Senate refused to endorse it. Now, what did the politicians do then? They improvised. All right, the idea is good. We move now to economics, Rome Treaty and to atomic power. Now here we have again now a crisis. Could we not move out in new fields? Well, the one would be to make the Eurogroup stronger. Where do we move now? Because we have a crisis. Great Britain will leave. This is my question to you. My second question, could you just imagine a little bit, following the statement of my previous speakers about criticizing the euro, what would happen if Germany would still have the Deutschmark? I think the Deutschmark would dominate also Austria. We had to link the shilling to the Deutschmark without having any say. The Deutschmark would be used in Paris, in Milano, and this would create anti-German feeling. So perhaps the German would have red baseball caps and saying, makes Germany strong again, like in the United States. Now, this is something which makes all neighbors of Germany nervous. Thank you.
Now, to start with the second question, in the Netherlands, we also said, we had the guild and not the shilling, but we said that we had a monetary sovereignty of 15 seconds. There was a time between an exchange rate or interest rate change in Frankfurt at the Bundesbank, and the very same interest rate change in Amsterdam. So it didn't really make a big difference. So it's better to then also have a guy sitting in Frankfurt on the board instead of the Germans deciding everything. Now your question on what new fields Europe could be entering as a result of this crisis. Well, we already spoke a little bit about it in the beginning. I think it is no coincidence with everything that is happening, including the election of Donald Trump, that people now speak more about defense, not about the European army, but about either way pooling resources or investment or developing, or be a little bit more serious about that. I'm not saying we'll go very far, but there could be things there. Of course, border guards has been a new thing, which did not exist at all 10 years ago. Then it started as a very small operation, and now there is not a European border guard as such, but it's, let's say, it's auxiliary troops, which can be called upon if a country faces pressure at its border. There are 5,000, something like that, 5,000 EU border guards as a result of this crisis. So indeed, there is often this productive dynamic of something happens and then the EU reacts to it. And I think that is happening almost under our eyes sometimes. And there's no reason that would stop. In Juncker's scenarios of last week, there was also the idea, well, maybe we could do a little bit less in certain issues. It was breaking a taboo, very interesting, that it comes from the Commission to say, well, maybe we should not pretend we can save every problem in the world. For instance, youth employment I mentioned. So I think the thinking, even in Brussels, about which I'm critical as well. I get attacked from both sides usually. In my country, I'm seen as a traitor, and in Brussels, I'm seen as somebody who is a Eurosceptic. So I don't know. I must be doing something right somewhere or not. But that is very interesting. That even in Brussels, this taboo of scaling back what the EU is doing is now part of the official thinking. And that is a result of Brexit. So I think, I presume we have to conclude that it will be very fascinating what will happen in the months ahead. Not immediately, because what will now happen with the Rome Declaration, it will basically be sur place. There will be no real decisions until after the French and German elections. And then there could be a kind of acceleration in what Europe wants to do, what it wants to be. And some of the constraints I write about in some of the initiatives that have been tried, but again, also referring back to what I said earlier, history is unpredictable. And I think one of the talents of Europe is this talent of metamorphosis and of adapting to changing circumstances. At least I have a confidence in that.
Let us finish with this optimistic conclusion, and we can continue the discussion over wine and cheese downstairs. Thank you very much. Thank you, Luuk van Middelaar, and stay tuned for our events in this series and our other events here at the IWM.